Well, good morning, everybody. Nothing like catching a bus on a rainy morning and getting here 2 minutes early. So apologize if I look a little ruffled, but I made it, but just barely. So welcome to our session here. First steps as a new police chief. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Paul Schultz. I see a few faces out there that I know. A little bit about me. I have been in law enforcement for 42 years, 22 years as chief. Been chief of 4 departments, so I've played this role as a new chief many times, and glad to share with you some successes and some failures as well, some trial by errors, if you will. I'll be available after our session if anybody wants to talk, and my contact information is up there on the last slide, and please, if I can ever help you, give me a call. Glad to do whatever I can to help you with this. This is a kind of a challenging field, if you will, as far as your first year on the job. And since I've been through this a few times, IACP asked me if I could share with you some of my experiences. I'm currently chief in Fort Morgan, Colorado, which is about 80 miles east of Denver. Last couple of chief's jobs, I've been hired to fix problems in the organization. But I want to kind of put that out there that I'm able to keep a job, but I've been asked to move around to try to help some things in our field. And I'm glad to do that as well. So let's just jump right into it. So as you know, police chief positions are highly visible, highly demanding, and it is truly like living in a fishbowl. And I tell new chiefs that whatever you do, you have to realize that you're doing this in front of an audience all the time, even when no one's around. That you have to be obviously not only above reproach, but you have to make sure all your decisions, all your actions, if it's on the front page of the newspaper, you can live with that. And if you're ever questionable, doing something questionable, it's always a good idea in my mind to fall back on that thought and say, wow, if this was on the front page of the newspaper, am I okay doing this? Because it could come back to haunt you, that's for sure. These positions are often praised, your actions, doing the right thing, doing a good thing, but also inevitably open to criticism. And this sometimes is challenging for a new chief, because if you're a seasoned command officer and you're thinking, you know, I've made a decision on something and it went well, and everybody for the most part's happy, I can promise you as chief that if you make a good decision, a solid decision, it's never going to be 100% right. And that's something I, for a while, used to struggle with. I'd say, you know, I'm never really 100% right in making this decision. But that's really the nature of the beast. Your tenure as a chief is tied to many issues, some of which you control, obviously, your performance, how you do in the community, how stable is the department, and then, unfortunately, in our job, things that you don't control. There are times that I call it the perfect storm. Things come together, and that's why in our country we have a tenure for agencies, small agency chiefs, 3 to 5 years. So we have to be really concerned with that. It's something that we try to control, try to mitigate as much as we can. Our presentation here today is really focused on small agencies, 100 officers or less. So if you're from an agency that's much larger, it might be some different dynamics that are there. But for the most part, I think we've got a pretty good set of guidelines here for agencies our size. So the first few minutes, we're going to talk about how do you get there? And then we're going to talk about things that you might want to consider doing after you get there. Some good advice that was given to me, and I certainly want to pass it on to you, is vary your career. You want to start early. If you have an idea you want to be chief, it's very difficult if you do 20, 25 years in one assignment. I always like to tell the story. I was a commander in a large suburban department in Denver, where I started my career. I was there 20 years. And our chief believed in job rotation, career enrichment. And I eventually got assigned to code enforcement, animal control. And that was, frankly, not really what I was interested in. And I went up to see the chief, and I said, wow, did I do something wrong? Are you upset with me? And he said, no, Paul, I'm not. I know you have ambitions after you retire here, and you need to vary your career. And frankly, I was not happy with my assignment. I did the best job I could, though. And when I was done with it, I got my first chief's job. And I'm in the oral board in front of the Civil Service Commission, and I kid you not, the first question I was asked, Paul, what do you know about animal control and code enforcement? And when it was over, I went out, I called my chief, and I said, you know, you won't believe this, but I really got to thank you for your wisdom and your foresight in putting me in this assignment, because that was the first question that they asked me, and the community, it's their number one concern. And now I've got that experience. I was able to convince them that I have some background in it, and ultimately got that job. So it is important that you look at different aspects of what your career in your main department is if you're looking at moving on to be a chief. Realizing that administrative assignments are critical, and this is the unglamorous side of police work: budget, policy, training, community relations, grants. That is a critical aspect to be able to explain when you get into that hiring process for your first chief's job. The other part of this, the college degree, becoming more and more standard. Just about everywhere today wants a bachelor's degree in some relevant discipline. Didn't used to be that way 20, 25 years ago, but today, certainly the unusual city that will not require a college degree. And of course, training. And the last point I want to spend a minute or two on, just a piece of career advice. Because these jobs as chief are fairly tenuous and sometimes things don't work out through no fault of your own, my best advice to you is not to take that job too soon in your career. If you're a 30-year-old chief or 35-year-old chief and things don't work out, that could be very problematic for your career. In my situation, I was fortunate. I had two mentor chiefs that had both retired, one from a large agency on the East Coast and one from a large agency on the West Coast. And I used them as mentors, I used them as role models, and I would meet with them, and they told me that they wanted to have a solid career first before they embarked out on trying to be a police chief. And I thought that was some good advice. Worked out for them, and it worked out for me, and I certainly share that with you. So your first steps, we'll get into this now. You've got your chief's job, and it's your first one. And how do you proceed from there to make sure that you're going to make a good impression and you're off to a good start? Well, it starts actually before you get there. It starts before your first day on the job. This is your time to study the department, look at current issues, do your homework. Find out what exactly are you facing, because you're facing not only internal issues. Obviously, something has gone wrong. The chief has retired. If you're lucky, if you're fortunate, you're moving into a department that's well run and you can hit the ground running. That has not always been the case with me. I seem to gravitate towards agencies that seem to have problems, and it's very good advice that I share with you that I got as well. Start the day you get the job as far as the appointment goes, finding out what is the issue and doing your research and whatever. You've got to learn about the department, and certainly newspaper clippings, online information is a good place to start. If you have a confidant in the department, a fellow chief in the area, kind of give you the inside story of what you're facing. The other aspect of this, I think, is just as important, is not only learning about the department, but learning about your boss. If you're making that leap of faith, don't get blindsided by the allure of this is a wonderful opportunity and you haven't researched your boss. I have a very good friend of mine. He did not do that, and frankly, he's in a living hell right now. Good department, good area, but it's just like oil and water between him and his boss. Don't be afraid to talk to the former chief. If he or she left on good terms, area chiefs as well. What is this manager like? What can I expect? Is there big turnover in the department as far as department heads? What's your tenure going to be based on? You want to visit, you want to learn about the community, you want to find out, again, what trouble spots there are, the historical applications of this. And now, let's talk about negotiating your contract. In my state, in Colorado, there's probably no more than 5 police chiefs that have employment contracts. What they have is employment agreements. And if you can get a contract, wow, I applaud you. If you're in a state that's civil service or a state that you cannot be terminated without cause defined as conviction of a felony crime, I applaud you. I serve at the will of the city manager, and I have to convince him, in my opinion, every other Tuesday night for my continued employment. I have a good relationship with my boss, but I am the definition of an at-will employee. So I've gotten a, not a contract, but a agreement of what the expectations are for my position. And I got an agreement that lists the pay, the benefits, and an area I want to share with you that's very important is what is your understanding and what is the agreement with the city in use to your car? Do you have your car for business use or personal use? I would encourage you to try to get that for personal use if you can. That broadens the use of that car quite a bit. If you just have it for business use and you decide to stop off on the way home at a grocery store or take your wife out to dinner, you may find yourself in a bad situation. So you want to broaden that as much as possible, and you certainly want to get that in writing. You can negotiate vacation time. You can negotiate the vehicle use, like I said. Job security, not very easy to negotiate, but you can certainly get a perspective of what the expectations are. And again, if you're lucky enough, you might get a severance package. If you can get one, I would suggest you start that discussion at about a 6-month severance. Because if things don't work out and you have to leave, you may have made a major commitment, a major move. You may have moved several hundred miles, and it's going to take a little bit of time to get things stabilized back in your life. So now we're talking about you're appointed, and you're going to set up a date where you're going to start, and you're going to try to understand the challenges that you're going to face. And there are 2 unique aspects to this. If you're a chief coming up in rank in that department, you certainly have challenges, but a different type of challenge. Or if you're a chief from the outside. There's different perspectives on this. The goal is the same, but the 2 different paths to get there. So let's talk about that for just a minute. If you're the internal chief, you have challenges. Longer you've been at that department, the more challenges you have. I look at myself and I say, you know, 40 years ago when I started out in this field, I was a young officer, I was a young man, and I had certainly all those attributes of being young and aggressive and having a good time on the job. And people remember that. And now, as you moved up through the ranks, that could be something that somebody would say, you know, I remember Paul when he did this, this, and this, and now he is of a different personality, of a different background. That can work against you. It's hard to manage that. If you're in a good position, you've been in command for a long period of time, you've been able to show your home department, your home organization, that you are ready to make that move. But that's always something that can come back to haunt you if you're not careful. If you're a chief from the outside, it might be easier to be accepted, but then again, you've got to earn the trust because you're the unknown factor. You're the person that's coming in from the outside, and there's always that degree of distrust until trust is earned, and we all know that. And how do you go about doing that, earning trust? Well, we're going to cover that here next few minutes. I encourage you to be as strategic as possible. Don't go into this and just say, well, I'll accept the challenges as they come. This is something I think you need to sit down, you need to plan, you need to write out what exactly are my goals, my direction as the new chief of police here. What is it do we need to challenge ourselves with? What is it we need to improve upon? You need to have a plan. And that plan needs to be tied to time. What are we going to do in the first 6 months? What are we going to do in the first year? And the overarching theme here is don't move too fast. Don't move too fast. You want to make sure that you've got plenty of time to institute your plan. As I talk to chiefs who have had problems, almost inevitably you hear the same thing: I went too fast. And we all know that change is difficult, and change for police officers is even more difficult. So slow and steady wins the race here. You're going to have a lot of meetings, and there's no way to avoid this, and you need to go into this understanding that my day is going to be consumed with meetings with new employees, meetings with the community, department heads. My new position here in Fort Morgan, my first month, I had 25 meetings, and virtually couldn't get anything done during the workday. I had to stay over in the evenings, stop in on weekends to try to do my job, because I was always in constant meetings. So it's something to be aware of. It can be shocking for you if you don't expect this. This last one is really critical. If you're taking notes, you might want to jot this down. You're going to be tested, and you need to recognize when this happens. I have done my best to not be in a position to be tested, but it has always happened. Without a doubt, you'll have some personnel issue that will come up. Could be a union issue, an association issue, could be an employee acting out. If you get a smooth tenure in that first year and you don't have this happen, please give me a call. I would love to hear that story. But every department I've been at as chief, all 4 of them, I've had this happen. And it's unfortunate, and they're fairly severe. I had an officer sleeping on duty. Hard to believe in this era. I had an officer act out recently with extreme rage at work. And what's happening here is you're tested and you're being watched by the rest of the department. What is the chief going to do? Is he or she going to be fair? Are they going to be thorough? Or do they believe in due process? Are they going to take their time? And I would encourage you to try to follow all those guidelines. You don't want to do a knee-jerk reaction on your first time that you're tested in a personnel matter. But you're going to have to act. You're going to have to do the right thing. And what comes with this job is some difficult decisions. And frankly, that's why you're hired, is to make those decisions, among other things. But again, I really reinforce the idea. Be thorough. Make sure that you believe and follow the whole concept of due process and a thorough review of whatever that situation is that you're being tested with. So after you learn about the organization, you're going into work, and obviously you're making introductions, you're meeting people. And I like this phrase: you never get a second chance to make a first impression. Are you friendly? Are you outgoing? Are you engaging? Are you showing that you're glad to be there? You're happy to be there? You're humbled by that appointment? Those are things I would ask you to consider when you make that first impression. If you come across as cavalier, callous, not caring, people remember that, and it's going to take years to undo that. The reverse, being a thoughtful, caring leader, believing in servant leadership, that's a good path. That's a good path, and put yourself in the position, if you haven't been there for a while, you're working for a new chief, you're curious as can be, what is this guy, what is this woman like? And they're going to be talking about you, and this is your time to start building credibility and building your reputation in the department. And you've got to really put some effort into this. This is the time where you want to stay late, you want to get in early, you want to meet people, you want to be seen. One of the worst things you can do is, even though you're working hard, spending too much time in your office. You want to be out there managing by walking around, visiting all your employees. You want to learn about the city. I find this particularly hard for me. This is a challenge for me. I'm in a new city. It takes me a little bit of time to get acclimated. Somebody says, well, why don't you go over here on, we're having a meeting on West Street, and I have to go find out, well, where exactly is West Street? Or we have a critical event, and I'm a little bit challenged on getting there. That's Those are difficulties that a lot of us face. It's always been my Achilles heel. But learning about the community, what are the challenges there? What's the history of the department? What do they expect from you? My current position, it's quite unique. I'm in the twilight of my career, and I accepted this with an understanding and an agreement that I'm not going to be there beyond 5 years. I have other plans. In 5 years, I'll be close to 70, and I didn't want to be in a position where the expectation was I'd be there 10 years, 15 years. So I'm there for a relatively short period of time by design to rebuild this department, to set it on the right course, to be my goal. The expectation is pretty high, to be the premier agency in Northeast Colorado. And I accept that, and we're trying to do that. Understand what the expectations are in the position you're taking. Some places, some managers just want to stay out of the front page of the news. Others are really aggressive and assertive and want a law enforcement agency that they can tout on a state level, a national level. You have to understand what that level is of expectation. How does government work in your new community? Is it on one end the scale, a good old boy system where it's designed to not rock the boat? On the other end, is it really all about performance, the best person for the job, looking to move the organization and the city forward, community service? Have an understanding of what that means where you're at. This last one, I'd put an asterisk by this, and I've seen a couple of different systems. What is the expectation of your interaction with City Council? Do you work for a manager that wants you to have no contact with them unless they contact you? Or is it okay to have some back channels of communication? I've had both systems. Honestly, which one I prefer, which one I think works best, is the one that's more tightly controlled. I'm kind of blessed right now. I have very little, if any, interaction with my city council. So far, I haven't gotten a phone call. Nobody telling me about their kid getting a ticket or, can you do something, enforcement in this area? I happen to like that. On the other end of the scale, early on in my career, I worked for a community where council used to call me once in a while. And I'll give you a tip that I learned. If you're in a community where the council calls you, what I practiced is, after I received that call, that request for service, I immediately emailed the manager. Every council contact, on duty, off duty, my manager knew about. And that worked very well, because as you hit some rough water, and you're going to hit rough water in this job, that's really one of the conditions of taking it and maintaining it, I was able to tell my manager, every contact I've ever had with a city council member, you have known about. There's never been any meetings that you need to worry about or concerned what was discussed. I've always emailed you that, hey, I ran into Councilman Jones. He had an inquiry about traffic control, and that has played well. Because part of this whole challenge here is for you to increase your tenure. And if your manager thinks that you might be using back channels, that's not going to help you. In fact, that's going to hurt you. Obviously, you want to learn about your staff, and you want to learn about them fast. They really fall into three categories, my opinion, general categories. Going to have superstars, going to have some people that are really, really good at their job. They're going to help you be successful. They're going to help the organization move forward. You need to find out who they are. You need to weigh heavily on them, use them, work with them, develop them. You're going to have people who are steady performers. They're sort of on the scale of a constant C, a constant B. And again, inevitably, you're going to have some problem folks. Experts tell us about 10% of your agency will be sub-performing. It could even fall into that problem category. And those people often, almost always, do this. They stir the pot. And I tell the managers I've worked for, one of my famous quotes is, it doesn't matter who the chief is. You could have Gandhi here. you're going to have a undercurrent of what I call dissent. And I get that out right away, because if they're expecting me as the new chief or you as the new chief to quell all the turbulence in the department, it's not going to happen. I've seen really good police chiefs and really good police departments, and they always have that undercurrent of 10% of a problem. And I think that's important for your tenure, for you to understand that as well. Don't get frustrated with that, because I don't think you're going to be able to change that 10%. You need to focus on the rest of the agency, the 80, 90% that are really doing a good job, that 15, 20% that are your outstanding employees. If you get too focused on the problems, then you're going to become skewed in your direction. But make sure your boss knows. Some of these city managers sometimes don't know that the new police chief, they don't understand that the new chief can't solve all the agency problems, especially with that 10% of problem employees. You want to set expectations early with the department and the staff. You want to have high expectations. And these are some critical areas for you to look at. Ethics. Obviously, you're going to bring a strong ethical background to that agency, and you want to make sure that everybody understands that. And this is where, if you're an internal chief promoted from within and you've had what I'll call a colorful past, that might be a little challenging for you. I remember when this guy used to do this, this, and this. That is not going to help you. The strong suit here falls a little bit if you're from the outside and you bring a new clean sweep approach. Hey, I'm all about ethics, values, and we're going to do the right thing here. So make sure you set that bar soon. Performance. What is an acceptable level of performance in your new department? I think it's our job to literally pull out the highest performance we can get from our employees. That's what you're there for. You're there to make sure that that you can motivate them, that they can do their very, very best. And I try to set that stage early. And I tell them, hey, this is going to be a lot of work, probably more work than you've done in the past. We're going to grow together. We're going to achieve greatness here. But especially with the command staff, and I kind of upfront with them, you may lose a Saturday once in a while here coming to work. And I love that when I ask the command staff, well, anybody here ever work on a Saturday? I know sometimes you get a few nods. I've also had several, well, what do you mean? I mean, I work Monday through Friday. What are you talking about Saturdays? And I said, well, because you're probably going to find yourself busy, and you may need to get caught up. And I also tell them that I'm very liberal with giving you time back. I'm not here to make you work a 6-day work week, but there'll be deadlines, there'll be internal crises, there'll be all kinds of things we need to work on that sometimes need to get done right away. So set that expectation soon. I also demand that the command staff and myself, that we are involved with the community. Every commander has some community board that they sit on, some community organization they're a part of, and trying to be the leader that walks the walk and trying to be the role model, I try to set the expectation for myself that I will do twice as much as the commander. So I always pick at least 2 boards minimum, and I wind up in more than that. But you need to let your staff know that you want your agency to be part of the community, not apart from the community. And fairness. Fairness is a central theme in any successful police chief. I tell my staff all the time, you really don't have to like me. I wish you would. I hope we do. I hope we get along. But regardless of how I feel about you or you feel about me, you can count on absolute fairness, absolute integrity, and absolute fairness in treating you with respect and in any personnel decisions. And I can tell you that has served me well over the past 22 years as chief. People that have worked for me will tell you that, yeah, he's absolutely fair. They might not care for me. You always have that personality factor. But fairness is a key here, and I wanted to share that with you. After you get there, you want to do an audit. After you set the stage and you're working with your staff, and you want to do this in the first few months. And these are some areas that you want to audit. You want to find the problems before the problems find you. And I hope that you don't find any, but that will be honestly not very realistic. So let's take a look at these. You want to conduct a financial audit of your agency. Where does the money go? What's the cash accounts like? Do we have any cash here? Who keeps that? What are the records like? I like to bring over the finance department and have them audit any monies that are there, any funds, investigative funds, funds that might be in the chief's office, funds that might be in the investigative commander's office. Make sure that there's a very strong audit trail. You don't want to inherit somebody else's problems. Where are you at with grants? Are the grants up to date? Are the reporting requirements up to date? Do you have grants? What I have found, my experience has been in the agencies that I became chief of, towards the end of the tenure of the preceding chief, a lot of this work kind of dropped off. It takes a lot of work in a small agency to administer grants, to go out and get grants, write them. And is that the case in what you're taking over? Are the grants being reported accurately? Evidence. Put a star by this one. An evidence audit. What does the evidence room look like in your department? Every single one, without exception, that I've taken over has been problematic. Not that evidence is missing, not that funds are missing, but every single one has been jam-packed, ready to explode, right at the max. We're one homicide case away from having to put the evidence somewhere else, always been on the back burner, and you walk in the door as the new chief and you inherit this problem. How do you solve that? How do you work on that? If you leave it as your predecessor did, it will definitely come to haunt you. I wish I had a magic bullet answer on how to solve that. I mean, we have purged evidence quite strongly. I've been able to carve out some overtime and put somebody in the evidence room with the specific assignment to get rid of the old evidence, to make space. I've brought in connexes through the DRMO program to build space, if you will, right on site. That's a problem you need to be aware of, and I would say you got probably a 90-95% chance of inheriting that when you walk in as a new chief. Do you have adequate security on that room? Department I took over recently had a padlock and a hasp. That was the security system. We're in the process of putting in a biometric system, works on a fingerprint, also a camera that will activate when the door is open. The whole system's going to cost us about $1,000. Best money that I think you could ever spend. You want to make sure that evidence room is absolutely secure, and you want to have a complete audit. You don't want to have a scandal 6 months into your administration that, you know, does anybody know where the cocaine is at? We're missing a lot of the cocaine. That will have a very adverse effect on your future there. What's the technology look like in your department? Are you up to date? Are you looking at bringing in new technology? What are the needs? Equipment, same thing. Is it clean? Is it operational? Is it being stored where it's easy access? It does you no good if you have a thermal imaging camera and nobody can access it. And we actually had that in one of the departments I was working with. We did this technology audit, and we had a $12,000 camera. Not only did no one know where it was, after we found it, obviously the batteries had died. And the question that I always ask is, what if we have a missing kid and we have a child that is lost, we're trying to find this kid, and are we able to break out all the equipment in the department that's necessary? What if it's your kid? What if it's my kid? Do we want to tell a parent that we are so mismanaged that we couldn't find a piece of equipment that might have saved your child's life? Of course not. So you want to make sure that's available. You want to have somebody look at it. One of the keys to success with this is assign that to somebody. Don't make it just a generalized assignment. All these functions you see up here, I assign to somebody in the department and have total accountability and have them report back. What does your personnel audit look like? Excuse me. Does everybody have their correct pay? Is everybody's vacation, sick time, PTO time correctly recorded? Do we have everybody's correct phone number? And I always go a step further. That's like the really basic here. This is where I like to go further, and I would encourage you to do the same thing. Every year, once a year, I will check my entire staff, everybody in the police department, starting with me. I always put me at the top of the list. Check to see if they're wanted. Does anybody have a warrant out for their arrest? Does anybody have a criminal history, a new criminal history, that somehow snuck through? I know that sounds severe. First time I heard it, I thought, wow, that is pretty severe. Don't you trust your people? And I do. I trust them implicitly. But I had a situation one time where an officer, his version of the story was he got into an accident off duty, and he sent in the documents to DMV to show he had proof of insurance. DMV says they never got him. DMV sent him a letter. He says he never got the letter. His driver's license was suspended, but he didn't know it. So we ran this check, see if he had a driver's license, everybody, starting with me, and his came back, he's under suspension. Could you imagine the headline? Police officer involved in accident, driving under suspension? I think we averted a tragedy. We averted a disaster. Don't be afraid to do that. Check your people. There was another city that I was asked to do some consulting with, and they actually had a couple of officers that had warrants out for their arrests, and they didn't catch it in time. And horrible press for that community. So that does fall in your lap to make that decision. Is everybody post-certified in your department? Is everybody on the road to maintaining post-certification? If you're in a state that requires a mandatory minimum number of training hours, are you on track for that? Colorado just went to that, 2015. We need 24 hours a year annual in-service training. Sounds like it's easy to do, and for the most part it is if it's a well-managed department, but I've spoken to several of my peers in Colorado, and for one reason or another, they've had some officers not make that 24-hour mark, and in our state, the whole agency is punished. What happens is you're not eligible for post dollars, and that could cost you $100,000 a year. So again, somebody's got to audit that. Somebody's got to make sure you're in compliance, you're on the right track at the halfway point of the year, that you're halfway through that training. So I like to take a look at what's on the right side here. What's working well? What's your department known for? And this is, well, you're meeting with your staff, your command staff, your supervisory staff, and the officers. What is it we do well here? And then what is it that's not working well? Obviously, that's your challenge. That's what you're there for. Figure out what is that solution to your problem areas. This last one is also really important. You need to find out what is the tone, the tenure, the strength, if you will, the influence of your union or your police association. And then you need to develop your strategy. I took over a department where the chief was in an adversarial position with the union, very, very adversarial. And I pride myself on that not happening. I want to work with the union. I actually share a lot of the thoughts and ideas of a professional union or a professional association. I want our officers to be as well compensated as possible. I want them to have due process. And I like to involve myself with this phrase here, confer with the union. Meet and confer with the union. I meet and confer with our association every month and take our union president out to lunch. City pays for it. It is the best investment you'll ever make. I'm not trying to curry favor with the union. I'm trying to show them that I'm fair, that I respect them, that we'll work together. They have a voice. I want to hear their voice. I want to hear their concerns. If you take that standoffish approach in 2017, it will come back to haunt you. Police unions, police associations in the modern era have never been stronger. And I have seen more chiefs lose their job over this one issue than really anything else. Strong police association, strong police union, take you out. So you want to work with them. You want to make sure that relationship is as strong as you can make it. This last department I was working with, kind of interesting, the union president was an older gentleman. He was a retired Chicago police officer in Colorado. So you could imagine some of the dynamics there. And we actually developed a friendship. He was a great guy. We got to be friends. And that worked not only to his benefit, but to my benefit, ultimately to the department's benefit. So we want to work with the community. Let me tell you what the issues are in my community today. If anybody has something similar, please see me after this presentation, because this is a new one on me. So we have a community of about 13,000 people, eastern Colorado. And we have a large beef packing plant there, 2,600 employees, process about 10,000 head of cattle a day. This is all new to me, and I find it quite fascinating. And they have difficulty hiring a workforce. So they go to other countries and they hire a workforce, they recruit, they bring them here, they advance them 30 days pay, 30 days housing, transportation. They don't give them any of this. They take it out of subsequent paychecks, but they give it to them up front. And they go to countries in East Africa, and particularly Somalia. And right now, with the travel ban, they're going to other countries in Africa, and right now focusing heavily on Puerto Rico. So our school system is about 59% immigrants. 27 languages are spoken in the schools where I'm at. Shouldn't say every, but many events have the word international in front of it. I think it's a great thing. I find it exciting. I've just never worked in an area like this that's truly this diverse. Very common in my community to see women walking down the street in traditional African dress. And I have to police this. I have to work with this, and I have to work with this community. I find it challenging. I find it very exhilarating. We're trying to get a grant to have an officer work with this immigrant community full time. So this is unique in my experience, but I knew that going in. I knew that this was something I would face and that work needed to be done in this area. So could you imagine if I didn't know this and I walked into that situation? I would be quite blindsided. What's the history of the community, especially with the police? Is it a good experience, or are they coming off of a scandal? Is there trust between the police and the community? If there isn't, you have the opportunity to build that. Wow. What's going to be your legacy? And I don't think there's a better legacy to build, is that you've increased trust between the community and the police. What's the history of the Office of Chief of Police? How long has the chief, your predecessor, his predecessor, how long have they been there? Did they retire after a long and successful career? That's a good thing. Or has there been a scandal, or has the union forced them out? You need a very, very clear understanding of what you're getting involved with. And sometimes I've talked to people that get a little blindsided with this over the allure of being a chief, especially the first time. I would suggest that you look a little deeper before you make that leap. Make the leap, not a problem, but know what you're leaping into. This is another very important area that I think you will be evaluated on. And what are the strategic alliances that you can develop? You can call them strategic alliances, partnerships, groups you're going to work with, but you need to spend some time developing this. To me, one of the ways that I evaluate a successful chief of police is, as I mentioned earlier, being part of the community, being part of that fabric of the community. And how you do that is through these groups. And it takes work. It takes time, going out, meeting these people, developing these relationships, making sure that they know that they have an ally in the police department. They can call you and their agenda will be addressed. So let's take a look at each one. School district. Spending time with the school administrator, superintendent, getting to know the principals. I just can't emphasize how important this is. One of the definitions that I learned early on of community policing, and you can ask yourself this, and this is where we're at a benefit, tremendous benefit in a small department. Do you know the names of all the principals in your schools? If you don't, you have to ask yourself, are you really practicing community policing? Is that a philosophy in your department that you know all the principals on a first-name basis? I would hope that you do. Same with the hospital. Do you know the name of the administrator? Do you work with the hospital? In a small community, a hospital is a central theme, and they can provide tremendous assistance to you as the chief. Obviously, the business community, but this next one is super important. That's why I put an asterisk by it. The bar owners. I have seen many, many chiefs. I've done several studies on this, and you'll see at the end how this ties together. But I've done many studies on tenure of police chiefs. How do we lose our jobs? And this is one of the top ones. For whatever reason, the chief may not be in sync with the perception of the community and liquor establishments. And what exactly is expected of you? What is too much? What is not enough of enforcement? How do you get along with the bar owners? So what I've done in the last 10, 15 years as chief, I have always started a bar owners association. And they are interesting people to work with. They're a little bit different than I am, and that's fine. But it's critical that I hear their point of view. And they're gonna push you. They're going to ask for things that you cannot deliver. And you have to be upfront with that. They're also going to ask for things that you can deliver. As an example, when we're meeting with our Bar Owners Association, they asked me, can you have your officers not park in front of our bars when they do downtown foot patrol? And of course my question was, well, why is that? And they said, because the presence of a police car at the front door of our bar actually cuts down on business. I'm going to lose money. Customers are not going to come in. So we entered into an agreement, handshake agreement. Okay, I'll have the officers not park right in front of your bar when they're doing foot patrol. However, when they get a call for service at your bar, they have to be allowed to park anywhere they want. And we were able to make that work. The next point was, how many officers are you going to have to do a bar check? And I said, well, I need at least 2. I'm not going to send anybody into a bar alone. And they were okay with that. And then they shared with me, well, sometimes your people doing bar checks and there's 5 officers. And I said, how can that be? And I checked, and they were right. They were right. We would have 2 officers show up. We had 2 trainees, 1 with each officer, that's 4. And then the supervisor would show up to watch them do the bar check. And obviously it's overkill, and we had to cut that back. But this group is very powerful. And imagine, if you don't have a relationship with them, imagine a group of bar owners in your community go into your city council or your city manager's office and say, you know, the new chief, we can't work with the new chief. He's too strict. He's whatever he is that's not in sync with the community. Who is going to survive that? Well, I can tell you, it'll be the bar owners. So you've got to find what that right relationship is. So I'm talking about enforcement. A couple of departments back, I was told, we don't really do liquor enforcement here. Local police don't really do liquor enforcement in a proactive manner. You can respond to situations that occur, but we don't do a lot of compliance checks, alcohol stings. And I said, well, that's the hand I was dealt. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's what I have to live with. So we were able to work around that with the state. And we would just bring in state alcohol investigators, state liquor investigators, and they would do the bar checks. We didn't reduce the amount of compliance checks, but you have to be very politically savvy, or you might find yourself in your mind thinking you're doing the right thing, and then looking for your next chief's job. So I'm not saying not to do the enforcement. I'm saying to do it in a way that you can politically survive. Faith-based community, very large today, very active, wonderful, wonderful ally to work with. We always establish a relationship with them. We always join their association. We encourage them to join our association. We always have chaplains. A lot of departments we're finding either have a chaplains program or it's gone away. They had one in the past. Always try to bring that back. Youth groups, very large with youth groups, trying to get them to understand our position. Curious, just a raise of hands, how many agencies here have a youth police academy, similar to a citizens police academy? Wow, it's just a great idea. Easy to do. We do it in the summer. If you don't have one, I would encourage you to take a look at that. It's not hard to do. Homeowners association, colleges, financial community is a big one. Bad checks, bad credit devices, working with banks today, lending associations is a whole another area of crime prevention. Obviously, hotel, motel associations, and put a star by this one. Again, we're back to special populations. My current situation, the immigrant population that we have in our community, I'm down there as much as I can, and it's challenging. It's very, very challenging. I was asked by a restaurant owner from Somalia, please stop by. We would love to see you, Chief, but please don't come in uniform or bring anybody in uniform with you. And I was quite curious about that. And why is that? And he tells me that in Somalia, if the police are there, you're thought of as an informant. And I don't want to be thought of as an informant to the police here. And I tried to explain that's not how we work. We're making some inroads. That took several months before we could get an officer in there in uniform and not have that perception of he was an informant for the police. Community services, seniors, youth, again, all areas you want to outreach to. You want to become known. You want to visit with them because, again, you are the new chief, and they'll want to meet with you. Now, at the same time, obviously, you want to establish a relationship with what I call allied law enforcement. And there's a whole list there. No need for me to go over it. These are agencies that you work with every day, agencies that you depend on. And I'm here to tell you, it doesn't always go smooth. And I think many of you have had that experience as well. I've had situations where everybody on that list there, I've had great relationships with, really, really good. And I've also had, unfortunately, situations that have been a little bit tenuous, not with everybody, but with some. If you can make it work, it's absolutely critical. If you run into a problem, don't feel too isolated because that happens. I've lost track how many chiefs, my fellow chiefs I talk to, that say, you know, I don't get along with the sheriff. I don't get along with the chief down the road. That's not that unusual. I hope you can make it work because it's actually a force multiplier. It's a success multiplier if you can. But these things do happen, unfortunately. But sheriff, DA are critical. Again, I have the post organization there. That's one that you should not overlook in your state. So let's get into some specifics of the internal audit. What are you going to look at, your agency? And this is a little bit in order. Certainly the top one, you want to look at the high liability. So you're there, you're the new chief, you're meeting people, you're setting up your agenda, you're doing your audits as far as your financial audits, and now you're taking a look at policy, procedure. Is it important to know, revise, update the wearing of the police hat on patrol? Well, yeah, but I'm of the opinion that's maybe a little bit later. That's a different perspective. Let's look at the high liability stuff. Do you have police pursuits? a policy regarding that that's contemporary? Can you defend that if you have litigation? As we know, that's a serious area. Cost law enforcement agencies more money in connection with pursuits, driving, than any other area, including use of force. Use of force is a close second. So what exactly is the state of affairs with not only policy in the high liability areas, but training, supervision? How about internal reporting in those areas? Do they need to be tightened up? I actually had a discussion one time, if you can believe this, over the use of warning shots. I had a command staff that thought warning shots were appropriate, and I looked in the manual of the department that I took over, and there was nothing that prohibited warning shots. So as you might imagine, we had to make some quick changes there. Morale. What's the temperature of your department? Are they happy you're there? I hope they are, for your sake. Or are they a little bit undecided? Did you succeed a very successful, happy, glad he was there police chief? Or was it somebody that perhaps was viewed as quite negative, and now you're the breath of fresh air? What's the morale in the department? Generally, my experience has been they're glad to see you. They're expecting great things, sometimes actually expecting too much. We all have limitations, and here comes the new chief, and I'm going to tell him or her all my problems. We need a 25% pay raise, we need new cars, et cetera, et cetera. Some of that's not realistic for a while. We all know that. But you need to understand what is the current state of affairs with morale. Is the structure right? Is the structure set up to where it's going to be most efficient, most effective? I'm going to agree with your chain of command. Same with staffing levels. Training is a big one. What is the state of affairs with training? Again, where are you at with the post requirements? I like this last one. I took over a department where if we would write a new general order, I noticed it took a long time for them to be implemented. And so I kind of delved into that. And I said, well, how long is it usually before, if we start a discussion on a new policy, before it's in writing, signed off by everybody? And I was told 6 months. And I said, has it been that way for a long time? And of course the answer was, well, forever. And I said, well, we need to change that. We need to get that down to 30 days, where we have a discussion about a new policy and we can get it out, signed off on, trained at roll calls, a 30-day turnaround. And we were able to do that. So how does that work in your department? Because you're probably going to want to make some changes. You need to look at different functional areas in your department as far as efficiency, effectiveness, patrol, investigations, communications, records. Records, they're all critical. Records is one that's often overlooked, but it's also just as important. What does the community think of you, and what is the state of affairs with community policing? This last department I took over, we had a discussion on community policing, and it ranged from, I think we do a great job at it, but I don't know what it is, to employees telling me, I don't know what it is, and I don't think we do a good job. So obviously, we need some training in community policing, and that falls on, I think, the head of the organization. So in the department where I'm at now, we're having a 3-session community policing training over 3 months for the entire department. Those are critical tasks for you to assess. So now we're into that 6 months to a year range. Again, always work with the post. You don't want to experience the wrath of post. Looking at reducing liability in those key areas, search and seizure being one of them, driver training. My experience has been generally the driver training, EVOC, has often fallen by the wayside because that's a little bit more intensive to set up that training. Sometimes in between the former chief leaving and you starting over, the old phrase, water will find its own resting place. My experience has been the departments that I take over, there's been a gap between the chief leaving and me coming on board. And not that the department is struggling, but they're lacking that vision that you bring. So they're doing very good day to day. They're doing very good from Monday till Friday, but nobody's thinking out, we need to set the stage for next year. That's kind of what you're there to do, so you'll find those gaps. You want to look at maximizing training opportunities. Small agencies, one of the major pitfalls that happens a lot of places, and I've seen it several places I've been. You'll review the instructor staff, and you'll say, do you have an instructor in EVOC, defensive tactics? And yes, we have one defensive tactics, one EVOC instructor. Ones are too short. If that one person were to leave, then your entire training program is thrown into havoc. So I'm in an agency now of 30 sworn, and I like to give you an idea of ranges. Instructors numbering 3 and 4 in each critical area. Have some depth on your bench. If somebody decides to leave, gets hurt, retires, you can still move on with your training program. That's a very often overlooked area, the number of instructors in skill areas. Your policy manual, another area, probably needs updating. My first chief's job, took over a department. The chief was assisting a mayor. He was chief of this smaller department, and he was assisting a candidate for mayor in a much larger city. And there had not been a new policy written in 3 years. And that department was very cognizant of that. Committees, I'm big on committees. They can get a lot of work done for you. They can add perspective. Here's a list of some committees you might want to consider starting if they're not there: a policy, use of force, professional standards, and awards. You know, a good, realistic, fair awards committee is really invaluable to raising morale. We all want to be recognized for our good work, but it's got to be good work, not just giving out awards. Take a look at your first opportunity for your new budget year. This is your chance, when you get your new budget, to make an imprint, your imprint on the organization. We all know that programs, equipment, training runs on the amount of budget in each area. So you want to maximize this. You're in a honeymoon period, and that's a very true statement. You've got a honeymoon, and you're there, and usually it lasts about a year, if you're lucky 18 months, and city council, the manager will say, we've got to give him, we've got to give her the resources to do the job that we brought them to do. My best advice to you is take advantage of it, because that's going to dissipate after a while, and then you're going to be in that tough budget cycle. So try to get federal, state grants. Look at service clubs. We fund our youth academy strictly with service club monies. We get all the Rotary Club, Lions, all of them to donate. One of your problem areas, virtually guaranteed, will be overtime. What is your overtime budget? Is it enough? Don't be afraid to ask for more at that point in time if you need it. Occasionally, you'll have a situation where the overtime budget is large and is being spent, and you're there to try to control it. One of the key things that I do, kind of a tip with this, is create a overtime tracking system. We track overtime in 14 areas. So at the end of the budget year, I can show by percentage and by dollar amount every place that overtime went, 14 different categories. So we have an idea what needs to be controlled, what's high, what's low. If you're just tracking overtime and you've got 2 or 3 areas that you're looking at, you're probably under-reporting. Staffing. Can you get extra people? Tough, very, very tough to get increase your staffing. But can you show the value of an overhire program? Overhire program is to use round numbers. Say you have $1 million in your personnel account. People coming and going through the organization. Very seldom do you spend all that $1 million. Let's say you spend about $900,000. So now you've got $100,000 left over, and that goes back in the general fund. I always try to initiate an overhire program, saying that if I'm authorized 30 officers to stay at 30, I need to have a staff of 32, and take the money that we would give back to the city, the savings, and hire 2 additional officers. Even though we still lose people, we won't drop to 28. With a staff of 32, we'll still hit that 30 number. It's a way to get a couple of extra people. This big one, I have a complete hour-long section on this, which obviously we don't have time for, but don't overlook corporate grants. Are you lucky enough to have a Fortune 500 headquarters in your area? Doesn't have to be in your city, just your area. Or do you have a Fortune 500 outlet? Every one of those Fortune 500 corporations has a philanthropic arm that will fund local projects for the community good. And we are very, as an entity, law enforcement is very underrepresented with this. So don't be afraid to send a letter off to a corporate 500 corporation, and you'll be surprised. You'll get funded. You won't get funded for some of the, what I call the harder aspects of law enforcement. The SWAT team won't get funded. Ammunition won't get funded. Weapons. But you're going to get things like domestic violence programs, youth programs, things that will make your community more attractive. Again, here's another area for youth programs, some things to consider. It is really a great idea if you can improve the youth perspective, the youth outlook in your community. A wonderful way to build your legacy, a wonderful way to build the effectiveness in your department. Long term, you can reduce the crime rate through a strong youth program. I think we all know that. Here's some ideas for you to take a look at. The one I want to focus on is a new program that we're doing. I'll share it with you. It's the third one down, youth outreach. I am really good. One of my strong suits is stealing programs. Not real good about creating new ones, and I don't want to take any credit for any of these being new. I've stolen every one of these from somebody else. And if you see anything up here that you like, please feel free to steal it, put your name on it. I don't mind a bit. I found out about this youth outreach program, and we're going to be doing it here before the end of the year. We're going to take 3 officers at a time. We're going to take 15 to 20 high school students selected by the high school, kids that are on the edge, kids that are having problems, kids that might not understand how the police work. We have trained 2 facilitators. They're going to train the officers for a few hours in the morning, 2 hours actually, 2 hours in the morning. And then the rest of the day, the officers are going to spend off-site with these 15 to 20 kids. And they're going to have a dialogue. And they're going to have lunch together. And we've gone to other cities and we've studied this. And what we found is after lunch, instead of having 2 separate groups, cops and kids, they're sitting together. And when they leave at the end of the day, they'll be on a first-name basis. And we're going to do that once a quarter with 15 to 20 kids like I described and try to make a difference. We have a lot of kids in our community that don't know anything about the police because they're from a foreign country, a foreign culture. I think we all know that today, modern policing, we need to maximize community programs. These are some examples, I think, of some successful ones. If any of you are interested in these and want to see me offline, please. I welcome the discussion. Crime prevention is just absolutely critical today. If you can get somebody in your agency to address that full time, I would suggest that. But all of these work well. Coffee with a Cop, we actually schedule this twice a month. We have 24 sessions. I require every supervisor to do a coffee with a cop and to bring their shift with them, at least one officer, meeting with different aspects of the community, different coffee shops, different times of the day. We track this by number, and we're having a just really excellent result with it. This is Police Chief 101. It's very critical for you to have a communication system in your department. Do you have regular meetings talking about the union, meet and confer? Do you meet, jumping around a little bit, but I think equally important, but very often overlooked, that bottom one on the left there, do you meet with informal leaders? We all have people in our departments that they don't have stripes, they don't have bars, but they are really the leaders of the shifts, the leaders of detectives. What they say is well respected. Do you meet with them? Do you have a dialogue? Can you get your message across to them? Hey, you know, this policy we put out didn't go over real well. What can we do to fix it? How are we doing? What's the perception of rank and file? That's a really critical aspect. Do you have a feedback system? One thing we discovered recently, we don't have enough communication in our department. And again, a beauty of a small agency. We have our daily roll call at 6 a.m. We have a staff meeting every 2 weeks, but we instituted a daily 9 o'clock meeting. 9 o'clock every day, we have a meeting. Now, the average length of time is 12 minutes. Everybody on duty comes in and we meet and just go around the table. What's new? What's going on? And no one is allowed to speak for more than a minute. But we're closing that gap of miscommunication. Very important thing here on the bottom right, do not forget the non-sworn. They can get lost in the equation here. So we go out of our way to spend time with them. Continued reevaluation, continued improvement. Don't be afraid to change course if things aren't going well. Just again, that first year, try to learn the organization. Try to set your strategic plan in place. You don't want to make change for the sake of change. Be strategic. One of the things that I like to do, if you can do this, if it's not too critical, if you see a problem and you know something's going to fail, but it doesn't involve somebody getting hurt, doesn't involve a lawsuit, but perhaps there's a policy procedure and you say to yourself, you know, I've addressed this somewhere else in my career. I know a better way to do it. And we're on the road to it not working. Consider this. Consider letting it fail. Letting it fail and then coming in with a change. I've done that on occasion, and it works well when you can show, hey, look, the way we're doing this, look what happened. It didn't work. Let's try it over here. If you change it on the front end, nobody will experience the failure. That's a delicate dance, I agree, but take advantage of it if you have the opportunity. I call it failure analysis. Watching failure and then responding to it in a very timely way. You want to continue with the community policing efforts, things of this nature. And our final part, this is the final slide here. This normally takes an hour as well. I think we can do it in the next 10 minutes or so. Hit the high points. For the last 15 years, one of my favorite tasks is I get up in the morning on Sunday, and I like to Google, search a couple of search engines that I know, and I query police chiefs. And I study police chiefs that have moved on, that have lost their jobs. And it inevitably is in two categories. Police chief retires, 35 years dedicated service. We're going to miss him. We're going to miss her. Great loss to the community. They've done a great job. That's over here. Over here, scandal. Police chief charged with drunk driving. Police chief having an affair. Police chief terminated. And that's the group I study. We all want to be over here in this category, and I hope all of us get there, but we need to understand this category so we can get in the other one. And these are the top 10 career killers. And I would encourage you to take a look at this. You don't want to be in this category. You want a nice long tenure. But this is how and why we are losing our jobs in this field. Poor policy and procedure manual. We don't pay attention to that. So something goes wrong, and now you're sued because your manual didn't address contemporary approaches. Or you have a personnel issue. You have a personnel issue that's not covered real well in your manual, and you have an employee who uses your manual against you. How about the evidence room? How many police chiefs do you know that have lost their job because the evidence room was not well maintained? The cocaine was missing. The lock didn't work right. We're missing money. That's why that audit when you first get this job is so important. And afterwards, continual audits. We audit our evidence room every 3 months, and then we do a complete audit once a year. I bring in outside auditors for the money. I have a real phobia with this, and I've had a couple of good friends lose their job because they haven't had the phobia. I would encourage you to really put some effort into this. Excessive force. Not excessive force by you as the chief, but excessive force by somebody in your department. I had a very good friend of mine. His officer had an officer who used excessive force, and it was the big story on the local news. A few weeks later, it happened again with a different officer, and the city council, the manager, I was aware of their discussions, and it was, can we afford to keep the chief here? He's a nice guy, but we've just had these two excessive force cases that are going to cost us a lot of money. Something is wrong. So my suggestion to you is to understand that you've got a control force in your agency. You've got to make sure that it's appropriate, not excessive. Theft. Well, we all know theft is wrong. We all know what it is. But sometimes we get a little confused about, is borrowing theft? I was aware of a case one time where somebody committed suicide with a very nice high-powered rifle, and that rifle was taken in. The wife of the person committing suicide didn't want it, asked the police department if they could take it in for safekeeping. They weren't sure what they were going to do with it. Hunting season came around, and the rifle was, quote, borrowed. Is that appropriate? Of course not. Misuse of funds, cars, and expense accounts. I mentioned to you earlier, make sure you know what type of provisions you have in your hiring agreement for your car, where you can take that car. Be careful with the meals. Obviously, we all know you can't buy alcohol with that. But these are getting audited more and more by outside groups. And I always err on the side of caution. Make sure all your receipts, all your expenses are not only accurate, but appropriate. Now, I'm going through these relatively quickly, but I think you get the idea. Sexual misconduct. This is really interesting. There's a theory that some, mostly women, are attracted to men in high, powerful positions. I've seen this. I'm sure some of you have seen it. I'm sure you may have seen it happen with you. Well, when it does happen, you've got to realize what's occurring here and realize that you are tremendously at risk. If you succumb to that type of situation and become involved in a relationship with a subordinate, this is not going to go well. I can tell you they never do. And almost always the outcome is the chief will be looking for a new job. You have to be very, very careful with that. Driving while intoxicated, 100% preventable. But we see this all the time. I see this every other month when I do my research. A police chief arrested for drunk driving, pretty much a career killer. If you get arrested for drunk driving and you're in the city car, I teach new chiefs things to watch out for, and this is one of them. I tell them, just mail in the keys. Don't even go back to work. I mean, that you cannot recover from that today. So always have a designated driver. If you're going to drink socially, never be in the city car, obviously. Hostile work environment. My second chief's job, I was there day one. I'm getting a tour of the police station. I'm in the men's locker room. There is a full-size poster of Britney Spears, very scantily dressed on a locker. And I was with the commanders, and I explained, well, we have to take that down. And somebody could find that offensive. It's the definition of a hostile work environment. And it happened to be on a senior officer's locker. We took it down. The senior officer came to see me and says, Chief, I don't understand why you did that. And I explained, well, somebody might find that offensive. Even though it's the men's locker room, that's not appropriate. What if there was, as an example, somebody down there who was a grandfather and had a granddaughter that looked like Britney Spears? I mean, that's something that we certainly don't want to deal with that complaint. And he didn't agree with me. And I said, well, I'm sorry you disagree, but as your career develops, you'll understand more about a hostile work environment. 5 years later, he was promoted to sergeant. And I give him credit. He came back, and he said, you know, Chief, I just came back from supervisory school, and we covered this in depth, and you were absolutely right. I never should have had that poster up there. And if you can believe it, he now is at this conference. So sometimes you've got to make that call. You've got to make that tough decision. You don't want to have anything that can be considered a hostile work environment. You have to be a team player. You have to be part of the city management team. Notice I said had, a weakness in this area. It was hard for me to understand the value of the librarian talking about story time for 5-year-olds. And it was quickly brought to my attention that discussion about story time with the 5-year-olds is often just as important as what you, as the police chief, have to comment on. And I took that to heart, and I think that's true. If you're the new department head and you can't assimilate with that team, you're going to be at risk. So you want to make sure you're a valuable part of that team. The last one is perhaps, in my opinion, the most insidious piece of legislation ever enacted that works against law enforcement, Fair Labor Standards Act. I could tell you a lot about it. I can tell you I've been sued twice. I lost both times early on in my career. We have very strict policies now that cover Fair Labor Standards Act. Used to be, when I started, you could volunteer. Saturday night, if you were a young single person, you wanted to volunteer, not be compensated, you could do that. It was a lot of fun. Suffice it to say today, you cannot volunteer. So you have to be compensated. Make sure you know about FLSA. Make sure you're not in a situation where a lawsuit will be filed against you. Certain assignments in the department are more predisposed to this type of scenario. Canine handlers. Every time that dog is off duty and needs maintenance, you either have to compensate the handler or have a contractual agreement. Narcotics investigators. All of these number of hours that they work has to be compensated somehow. So don't fall into that trap of not compensating them. You wind up getting a lawsuit and you have to take what I call the long walk to City Hall to explain how you're going to have to pay out $100,000 in a small department where you don't have the money. Could be problematic to your future there. So this is one you want to make sure that you're aware of how it works. And as you know, people who sue under the Fair Labor Standards Act can go back 3 years. So 10 minutes early every day for a roll call that we used to volunteer for today has to be compensable. Your schedules have to permit that. Otherwise, you could wind up with X number of officers suing you for 10 minutes a day for 3 years. That's going to add up to quite a bit. So that's our presentation. I hope that gives you some idea of first steps. It's challenging, it's exciting, it's rewarding. Does anybody have any questions as a group we can answer? If not, I'll be around. I'd be glad to talk to you. Yes, sir.
When you come in and you assess your department and you identify maybe some changes that you think are needed to further the agency, how do you navigate moving people from assignments and maybe putting people that you trust in better positions to see? Sometimes those that keep reporting replaced because the previous chief knew them or what happened.
Just an excellent question. I try not to make any personnel changes for that first year. But I impress upon my staff that I believe in job rotation, career enrichment, and that I'm looking at everybody moving every 3 to 5 years. 3 years on the short end if they struggle or they don't like where they're at. 5 years if they're doing an outstanding job. And that's really a good question because I've faced that everywhere I've worked. Well, we don't really want to move. We're happy being where we're at, and I try to impress upon them we need to plan for the future. You'll be a better commander if you've served in patrol and detectives and admin when you get there. And most people get it, but every once in a while you have somebody who doesn't. Yes, sir.
So, I started this department about 9 years ago, and the borough council and the mayor and the police association have been at war for 5 years. I mean, war. So the politicians have done some questionable things. How do you balance that loyalty between your boss, the mayor, and police association so that you don't get side?
Delicate dance, that's for sure. If you've been there 9 years, you're doing a good job. And that 9 months. I'm sorry. Well, call me if you're there 9 years. No. You've got to play to your constituency, and that could mean a little bit of a different discussion with each group. I always try to get the best deal I can for the cops. I really do. But at the same time, you've got to manage that relationship with your appointing authority, which sounds like it's the mayor. Yeah, that's tough. That one is really tough. In that equation, don't forget the cops. You've got to play to both. Yes, sir.
I've been there for 90 days, and I inherited a situation happened 2 or 3 years ago where an officer was actually dealt with it. He was one of our motor officers. He was coming in, clocking in, and then going and working a part-time at a bank on duty.
Oh,
And so, right, so virtually everywhere you go, everybody will say that's a fireable termination offense. In this particular case, the officer was Hispanic. The former chief had made pretty clear that there would be no disciplinary action taken against any officers that were Hispanic or female or anything other than white. So he got, yeah, that was pretty much his statement to the commanders there. So he got, the officer got 30 days, but he was allowed to take those 30 days of vacation time. The case was not presented to the district attorney, which there were several issues there that could have been criminal.
sure,
Obviously.
sure.
So now I've inherited that person. We're coming up with some Brady stuff, and we've had to report Brady issues to the district attorney's office, and we haven't heard back from them on that particular case. But this officer also just won the County Officer of the Year award, voted out.
Because he's a hard worker. He can work 2 places at the same time, that's why.
So that's the challenge that I'm facing with. I think from a fairness level, the officers in the department know what should have happened.
Sure.
And I think they would support me. At the same time, from the community level, all that, this is obviously a beloved officer in the community. And I don't know, that case, in fact, people in my own city, the city manager never knew, because it's really hidden in the department. So the city manager, when I explained the situation to her, she didn't have a clear understanding of what actually had occurred 2 or 3 years ago. So I'm kind of at that point where, I mean, I know what I should do, but it's not the easy decision, obviously. And I know
I'm not sure you can go back and do something that's 3 years old. But I know what I would do is I would put that person on day shift where they can be watched. I would make sure their supervisor knew what has happened in the past. I would audit that timesheet very closely, and I would send that person to remedial training in the area of ethics. And if it happens again, there'd be some pretty severe disciplinary action. Yeah. Sometimes you inherit something that wasn't handled right, but if it happens on your watch, that's what I call moral courage to do the right thing. A very famous phrase was said to me one time, and I really believe in it. If you get fired for doing the right thing, you'll have no problem getting a job. If you get fired for doing the wrong thing, you'll have a problem. So if that was to happen under your watch and you fired that person and politically it didn't fly, you won't have any problem explaining that to your next oral board. Yeah, I got fired for doing the right thing, upholding integrity and ethics. Yeah. Any other questions?
Chief, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Do you have any other programs or seminars that you put together?
About a dozen.
About a dozen?
Yeah.
Are they available at your website, or can we email you?
Sure. Email me. I'd be glad to work with you, whatever you need. I teach a couple other venues, and my mainline course is managing small law enforcement agencies. And I'll just mention that real quick. I'm not here to promote myself in any way, but if your area, if you're interested, I do teach a 2-day course on how to manage small law enforcement agencies, and we cover all this and a lot more in quite a bit detail. So yeah, I'd be glad to work with you. Well, thank you very much for coming. My honor to be here. I'll be around for a few minutes if you have any questions.